Welcome to our brand new unit on absolutism and how absolutism leads to revolutions around the world. So what you're looking at right now is a map of during that Renaissance time period, at least for part of it, all of the countries that are in front of you were led by absolute leaders. In our last lesson, we explored what the concept of absolutism, and I'm hoping that you can apply what you learned last lesson to this lesson as we start our unit. In the 1700s, France was considered the most advanced country in all of Europe. It had a large population, prosperous foreign trade. It was the center of something called the Enlightenment. And France's culture was widely praised and imitated by the rest of the world. However, the appearance of success was deceiving. There was a lot of unrest in France. Some of this unrest was caused by bad harvests. There was a lack of food, which led to really high prices and high taxes and really disturbing questions that were being raised by the Enlightenment and by the Renaissance in general. There were some enlightened thinkers like John Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire that were causing people to question the way that things had always been done. So here's your Roman numeral 1 for your notes. The French Revolution begins. And today we're going to be exploring how the inequities in French society lead people toward revolution. So in the last lesson, we talked about absolutism, and we did a jigsaw activity where you took either Spain or France or Russia or Norway's leaders, and you compared those absolute leaders for commonalities. And we're hoping that you noticed that they had absolute control over the entirety of the country, that oftentimes in absolutism, there is this justification of what they're doing by God, or at least that's the message that's sent out. Sometimes that's called the divine right theory. Sometimes it's called the mandate from heaven. But this idea that God kind of is giving them permission to be their representative on earth, which leads you to believe that you shouldn't question them. So they have absolute power. They're granted that power by God. And third, there's usually no check on their power whatsoever. There's no balance. So we looked at this image, and that was one of the ways that we started off our exploration of absolutism. And then you did an activity. And these are some of the definitions that your peers came up with. So your first job was to open your notebooks, start your notes, and then define absolutism. And so if you have ideas in your own head about how you want to do that, go ahead. And if you need to be inspired by your peers, take a look at what they have said. All right, let's go. So today we're going to look at how absolutism led people, and the inequities created in that situation led people toward rebellion. So here is the overarching ideas for the top of your notes: absolutism and the French Revolution, and eventually we'll get to Napoleon. Okay, just to get you involved and to introduce you to two enlightened thinkers, I wonder what you think. I wonder, without too much kind of contemplation, if you agree with somebody like Thomas Hobbes, who says that, you know what, if we just didn't have leaders at all, if people were just left to themselves, what would happen? Thomas Hobbes says that, our very nature is greedy. And if you left us completely alone and didn't have some sort of organized government overseeing us, that we would fight each other. That people would take more than their fair share and they would fight to get it, which would lead to conflict. So that's one enlightened thinker, Thomas Hobbes, who says, you know what, we have to have government. Maybe it doesn't have to be an absolute leader, but we have to have somebody helping us with some rules and regulations. On the other hand, there's a guy named John Locke, and John Locke has a more optimistic view of human nature, and he says, you know what, if you did leave people alone, they would be okay. Most people would be reasonable. Most people would respect others. And, people have the right to life, liberty, and property, and that we can be trusted as human beings to take our fair share of something and not take in excess. So I wonder, who do you think is right? Is Thomas Hobbes right? We have to have government. Otherwise, people will just take more than their fair share and cause conflict. Or is John Locke right? We can be trusted to just leave us alone. So in the backdrop of all of this, those enlightened thinkers are having those kinds of conversations. And away we go with your notes. So the next 2 slides, you should write everything on the slide. In the 1770s, the social and political system of France, called the Old Regime, or the Old Order, remained in place. And under this system, the people of France were divided into 3 really big social classes, or estates. So the Old Regime, or the Old Order, was a social and political system in France during the time period in which all of the people were divided into 3 social classes. You can see right here, the visual is giving you a heads up that we're going to have 3, and the clergy and the nobility and everybody else. That's going to be the 3 estates. So let's take a look at how that system worked. So the privileged estates were the first and second estates, and here's a little bit about them. They were called the privileged estates for reasons that we're going to come back around to, but they had more power at the end of the day. So 2 of the estates had privileges, including access to high offices. They were exempt from paying taxes. They were not granted, those privileges were not granted to the third estate. The very first estate was made up of the clergy. The Roman Catholic Church, whose church officials are called clergy, formed the first estate. They owned 10% of the land in France. They provided education, relief services to the poor. They contributed about 2% of their income to the government in the form of services to people. The second estate was made up of old noble families. And although they accounted for just 2% of the population, they owned 1/5 of the land. 20% of the land was in the hands of these old noble families. So 2% of the population, roughly 20% of the land, and again, paid no taxes. So the majority of the clergy and the nobility, they didn't like those enlightened thinkers that were starting to question this system, right? They didn't like Hobbes and they didn't like John Locke. And they liked Locke even less than Hobbes. But they didn't like anybody who was kind of questioning how this old system worked, because they were winning in the old system. So the majority of the clergy and nobility scorned Enlightenment ideas as radical notions that threatened their status and power as privileged people. Okay, so the first estate is right over here. The second estate is here. And then you can see the third estate has the bulk of the people. About 97% of the people in France belonged to the third estate. The three groups that made up this estate differed greatly in their economic conditions. The first group was called the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, and they were bankers and factory owners and merchants and professionals. They were skilled artisans. Oftentimes, they were well educated. They believed strongly in Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. And although some of the bourgeoisie were kind of rich, maybe even as rich as the nobles, they paid really high taxes. And like the rest of the third estate, they didn't have political power. Many felt that their wealth entitled them to, more social status and political power than they had. The workers of France's cities formed the second group in the third estate and poorest group within the third estate. These urban workers were like tradespeople, apprenticeships, laborers, domestic servants. They were paid pretty low wages, frequently out of work, and they often went hungry. If the cost of bread went up, mobs of these workers might attack grain carts and bread shops to steal what they needed. Peasants formed the largest group within the third estate. They made up more than 80% of France's 26 million people. Peasants paid sometimes half of their income in dues to nobles, in tithes to the church, which is like taxes to the church, and taxes to the king's agents. They even paid taxes on basic things like salt. Peasants and urban poor resented the clergy and the nobles because they had privileges and they got special treatment. The heavily taxed and discontented and angry third estate was really eager for change, and you can probably understand that. Then the question becomes like, when the third estate pays their taxes, like what do absolute leaders like King Louis of France, what do they do with that? And this also angered the third estate. So what you're going to see next are a couple of images of the kings of France. There's a King Louis the 14th, a King Louis the 15th, a King Louis the 16th, and a King Louis the 17th that all reigned during this kind of time period. And you can see that they are not hurting. I mean, just these clothes alone are super expensive. Notice during the time period, we still are talking about men wearing skirts with their legs exposed, specifically posing so that you can see their calf. We talked about that before. And having slits in their clothing or the hem of their clothing show off the leg. And the heel makes the calf flex. Notice the long curly hair. If they didn't have that naturally, they wore wigs. And this symbol right here is the fleur-de-lis, and you'll see this on all kinds of things. It's a representative symbol of France. So what did they spend this money on? They spent their money on really lavish clothing. And they spent their money on building this palace at Versailles. In the last lesson, I talked to you a little bit about how Versailles started off as a hunting village, and then gradually it was added and added and added upon until it became this, one of the most visited tourist attractions when people go to France. And I talked to you about the sculpted gardens and how they were like the kind of setting for Alice in Wonderland. This is the Marie Antoinette's bedroom inside of Versailles. All gold thread woven into the fabrics, really elaborate designs, over the top luxury. This is one of King Louis's apartment bedrooms. If you pull these curtains back, there is a really elaborate bed right here. This is the Hall of Mirrors. This is kind of one of the entryways into Versailles. On the left are all mirrors, and on the right are open windows to natural light. So these chandeliers are priceless. Note that on the top, you're talking about artists that have painted, again, priceless pieces of art on the ceilings. The gardens have water features, paths to walk. During the time period, there would have been peacocks like strutting around in the gardens as you walked. This is the red velvet wallpaper that I was telling you about before in one of the king's beds. Notice the sun here. The sun was kind of a symbol of the King Louis's power. He was called the Sun King. The paintings and chandeliers run throughout the palace. And so people actually don't know how much it cost total to build Versailles. But recent estimates place it at possibly around $2 billion. But that's probably an underestimate because they don't think that they kept track of all the expenditures. So perhaps a $2 billion investment while people are not getting enough to eat. Okay, so now we're going to talk about homework in our virtual environment. And we're going to do something like this, but only in remote form. So next we're going to slide over to your homework. I wanted to show you just a little bit of Versailles. This is a little bit of a flyover.
The gardens of Versailles, created by André Le Nôtre, are a key component of the royal residence. They surround the chateau on three sides. In the 1660s, the east-west axis became the Grande Perspective. The gardens surrounding the palace were made up of parterre, enhanced by fountains. They are extended by paths opening onto copses with surprising lawns and water features. King Louis XIV had the Grand Trianon built in the grounds as a summer family residence and refuge from the hubbub of the court. King Louis XV fitted out the Petit Trianon for Madame de Pompadour, and Louis XVI gave it to his young wife, Marie Antoinette. The Queen gave orders for the gardens to be replanted in the English style and built a rustic hamlet, a working farm, complete with cottages.
Okay, so in order to explore those concepts today in Google Classroom, you have an assignment called French Society Prior to the French Revolution. When you open up that Google Doc, you're going to have some charts on the top and some text for you to explore. It will look something like this. You'll each have your own copy. There's a rubric attached. And your directions are to look carefully at the chart, practice close reading skills like I'm demonstrating here by highlighting words that you're not sure you know or that you think are important. Highlight, make some comments for yourself to keep things straight. for example. And then take a look at the directions. It asks you to explain 2 ways that the pie charts help you to understand the selection. So my thought is the first thing is to demonstrate the understanding of the selection. So you're going to write a summary and then include information from both the reading selection and the pie charts as evidence to support your answer. I'm looking for 5 well-written sentences to receive full credit. And here's an example of what that might look like. So the selection tells me about the 3 estates in France before the French Revolution. It tells me that the first estate was made up of church officials who made up 1% of the people and owned 10% of the land. So that's straight from the text here. 1% of the population and 10% of the land. First estate. And then I'm taking something, I need to get 2 ways the pie chart helps us to understand. So I'm going to look to the pie chart and I'm going to look and I see this one on land ownership. That would help me. So this is just making that point in a visual way. And I want to make sure that whoever's reading this understands what I'm using. So in bold here, I have the land ownership chart so that people know what I'm talking about. Helps me to see that by showing that 10% of the land was held by the first estate, that according to the chart was only 0.5% of the population, and the second estate controlled another 25%. And then I'm going to cite that land ownership chart and then close my sentence. So that's where I got that information. And look at over here, it was talking about the population of the first estate actually only being 0.5% of the population, so even less than the text said. Okay, I bolded that just so you could see it. So now I have text information and I have chart information, and now I just need to repeat that process again. The selection also describes how the third estate was made up of the majority of the people, 80% of the population, which included everything from peasants to city workers. And actually, that's a mistake, right? 97% of the population, 80% of that being peasants. Which included everything from peasants to city workers. And then I'm going to use another piece of the chart, the government taxation, because here is where, the big inequities come. The third estate paid 100% of the government's taxes. So the government taxation chart makes it clear that the third estate paid all of the taille, or taxes. And by using this word, it demonstrates that I read the text that talked about calling the taxes taille, right there. Okay. The selection in charts makes it obvious that the system was unfair and the people at the bottom with the least were asked to pay the most. I'm double checking that I make sure I have 5 sentences here. So when I read it over, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I have my 5 sentences. I have 2 pieces of information from the charts and also, I think, a summary of what I read. And so I'm feeling good about that. And I'm going to turn that in.